contractor and ex-Cuba prisoner. You don't want to miss all of these interviews coming up, so do stay with us. First, though, the top story of the morning, Donald Trump headed to Washington today, reportedly to meet with nearly 24 top Republican leaders and fundraisers in an effort to improve his relations with the party's establishment. The meeting coming as more than 100 delegates are up for grabs in both the Arizona primary and Utah caucuses tomorrow. Joining us now is the Washington Times reporter Kelly Riddell. Kelly, it is good to see you. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
How important are Arizona and Utah, and who has the most to gain here? Let's talk about tomorrow's big contests.
Well, I think you have Ted Cruz with the most to gain and the most to lose here. He really needs to pull off a victory in Utah, and he needs to get above the 50% threshold there so he gets all of the delegates. What you could see is John Kasich being a spoiler. Ted Cruz is really betting his money on Utah. He also, you saw him change his schedule yesterday and take a surprise trip to Arizona. What that might mean is that internal polling there puts him a little closer within striking distance to Donald Trump, who's expected to take that state.
Yeah, that's interesting. And Doug High, these contests become increasingly important, every single contest for a Ted Cruz.
No doubt about that. And
at this point.
One of the things that's interesting with the Cruz campaign, if you talk to them, they're confident that they'll win Arizona on Election Day with Election Day voting. But that speaks to the real advantage that Donald Trump has. His early voting has been massive for him. If Cruz is able to not just win on Election Day, but eke out even a one-vote victory in Arizona, it builds his case moving forward so much more.
And even though Dagan McDowell, you know, Donald Trump has been obviously victorious with most Republicans, the Cruz campaign tells me they feel that they have a clear path if he does well with the remaining contests.
And so Cruz's path is to take it to a contested convention, right? Because he's got to win more than 80% of the remaining delegate, 83% of the remaining delegates to get to 1237, which is highly unlikely compared to 57% for Trump. And over the weekend, you heard Reince Priebus, the head of the Republican Party, essentially saying that they're preparing for a contested convention.
Let me bring some of that to you, because Reince Priebus joined me yesterday on Sunday Morning Futures, and he basically said exactly that he's prepared to run a historically transparent convention. Watch this.
We've got candidates that have a pathway to getting to the majority of delegates before Cleveland, but if that doesn't happen, obviously we'll be prepared to run the most open and transparent open convention in the history of our party.
There you go. I mean, they are taking steps to actually expect this.
And that's a shift from his tone just earlier this month when he was talking about it being highly, highly unlikely, I think was one of the phrases that he used. And I just don't know how that goes over with voters. There's such a divide with the Republican Party. That doesn't mend the fissures in the party if it goes to a convention.
Kelly, what do you think about that?
Well, I think that Donald Trump still has a possibility of winning this thing outright, and that we shouldn't count him out, and that the contest tomorrow, we'll see what his path is forward. But if there is a contested convention, listen, he can go. Donald Trump is preparing for that as well. He's going to all of these delegates that are uncommitted. There's about 322 of them. He can win this on the first ballot. If it goes to the second ballot and the RNC and party insiders start shenanigans in terms of naming a third party or somebody who hasn't even run in these primaries on the ticket, I think the Republican Party has some real problems going forward then.
Have you ever seen this kind of backlash to a candidate? I know you're on that side.
No, never.
You're among those pushing back.
I mean, there are many reasons why Donald Trump is a unique candidate. The backlash he faces within his own party speaks to that. And we were talking about Utah earlier. Polling has showed from yesterday that Donald Trump as a nominee could lose Utah, the most Republican state in the union. It's another reason why so many Republican Party leaders and certainly our Senate candidates and House candidates are nervous about what his candidacy would mean.
Well, certainly you're seeing the establishment labeled Donald Trump as a rhino, right? Republican in name only. They're going after his past policies, which are very liberal. But one of the things that we haven't talked about is, where's Kasich going to get another win? Can he take another state? He's hoping on an open convention, correct? I mean, there's no path for him. He's mathematically eliminated. So isn't he relying on that?
You talked about 83% for Cruz, 112% of remaining delegates, which is obviously impossible.
And he's also banking on a rule change, right? Like, I mean, you have to win at least 8 states in order to be on the first ballot. So he's hoping that before that even goes to a convention, there's a rule change that qualifies him. I mean, it's a long, long, long shot.
You think he's basically just saying, look, I'm in this to be vice president?
You know, right now, he says no, and, and so we got to take him at his word. Yeah, we got to take him at his word right now, but who knows? I think he'd be smarter if he got out, if he wanted that
Let's talk about this violence for a second. Donald Trump's sister now getting targeted over the weekend, receiving a threatening letter one day after Trump's son, Eric Trump, received a suspicious letter with white powder inside. Remember that happened last week. All of this coming as more violence broke out in Arizona during one of Trump's events over the weekend. Things are just continuing to escalate, Kelly. How does this change the situation?
I don't think it changes it much for his core supporters. And the more, you know, Trump rises, the more he becomes a threat. The more threats I'm afraid that he's going to receive. He's testing the party's bounds. He's testing the American populace. He's a very polarizing figure. Yeah. It's a terrible situation. But for his core supporters, I think that you're going to see them rally around him some more and not flake off.
In terms of the eruptions of these protests at his events, not his fault. I'm sorry. I don't care how many times people point fingers at him. But one thing he can do, and it speaks to what he was saying, his daughter Ivanka was saying. Yeah. He can change how he acts on Twitter. He can change how he particularly acts on Twitter. Like you know, step back, stop taking shots at people who, frankly, don't matter that much to his presidential campaign.
Well,
but he can't help
not only on Twitter, but also at the events, he can say, "Please remove this person," or be like, you know, we can hear your voice or objections later. Instead of throw him out, you know, punch him. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So he could actually do that.
At the events, though, they do start, and I've been at several at these events, they do start saying, if you do see a protester, if someone starts yelling, just point, we'll peaceably remove them, do not hit, do not. So there is that, he is making those inroads in those areas.
Sure. Kelly, I'd ask, you know, how are those being perceived at those events? Is it a bit like getting on the airplane and not listening to the safety announcements, or before a baseball game, not paying attention to the code of conduct? Are people listening to those? Because we haven't seen that.
People are actually listening to those, and this just started happening last week after the Chicago protests, where they say, everyone should calm down, just point them out, point and say Trump, Trump, USA, USA, and we will get the security officials to remove them. Yeah. But please don't lay a hand on them, and that is going on. But these, a lot of these protesters want to be forcibly removed. They want to sneak in, take their shirts off, start protesting, and then they have to be removed from these events. So this is not Donald Trump's fault as much as it is, these protesters. Everyone's got a First Amendment right, and we've got to respect both sides.
Kelly, stay there. I want to get your take on this upcoming story as well, because President Obama making an historic 3-day trip to Cuba, landing in the island nation yesterday, but the trip is not coming without controversy. Just hours before the president actually touched down and landed, Cuban authorities arrested more than 50 protesters. They were marching to demand better human rights. Critics are also calling out Cuban leader Raul Castro for not greeting the president upon his arrival. Your thoughts about the Cuba trip? Do you view this as a big step for U.S. relations with Cuba, or what? What's the point?
Well, it can be, but I mean, first there needs to be some more economic transparency and provisions for U.S. companies. I mean, it's very hard to change Cuba if a U.S. company can't go down and invest in property there, or have to enter a JV where they don't have a majority stakeholdership. These things have got to change in order for real progress to be made. This looks great on the surface, but as you know, the more dissidents are being jailed in Cuba. Change isn't coming, and then Raul Castro wasn't there to meet the president. And on the face of that was an insult. So a lot more needs to be done here.
What do you think about this, Doug?
Well, what we've seen from the president, what's troubling, I think, for a lot of Republicans, isn't necessarily just the opening to Cuba. It's that and this speaks to what Donald Trump's candidacy is all about. It's been a weakness by the president to try and extract anything from Cuba. Essentially, the president has called Raul Castro and says, we're going to give you everything you want. We don't need much in return except for good headlines.
Yeah.
It seems like the Iran deal, right? I mean, this is a precedent. I mean, he's continuously done this in relations with nations that that have been aggressive towards us. And I understand taking a small step to try to make some change. We know there is going to be a regime change over there. The Castros are getting older. We have seen a baton passed.
Is that the excuse for him not showing up at the airport to greet him?
Possibly. I'm sure they're intimidated. I mean, and then you're seeing protesters. But, it's unfortunate, but it is a small step. So hopefully there can be big leaps after this administration leaves.
That's interesting. I mean, what is the point of him not showing up to greet him? I mean, does he not want to have better relations?
I think
is this just Obama's plan?
I think Raul Castro showed up to greet the Pope when he arrived in the nation, and he didn't show up to greet our own president. I think that's
He's trying to show a sign of strength, right? I mean, that's what he's trying to do.
Why are we there? Why
are we there? Exactly.
Why? I mean, why the concessions? Why normalizing of relations, so to speak, and we didn't get anything in return? Plus, I guarantee you, they want to give Guantanamo Bay back to Cuba.
So from that regard, it does sound like Iran.
Yeah, it does.
I mean, it's the Iran deal. We're getting nothing back.
Without the potential nuclear weapon.
Right.
And if you look at what Obama's done so far, just in Cuba, tweeting to Cuba, "What's up, Cuba?" He was on a Cuban comedian show. So what's interesting is he's campaigning almost in Cuba the way he campaigns in the United States. Instead of hard-hitting interviews with journalists, obviously not a lot of hard-hitting journalists in Cuba, but not getting to the tough issues, trying to be the cool president and the popular guy, as always.
Yep, it's true.
It goes back to his legacy. He's done that time and time again. I mean, when he had carte blanche after he was elected in 2008, instead of addressing the economy, he did the Affordable Care Act. He wanted the label Obamacare, right? Yeah. So that's what's happening.
Very similar. Kelly, thank you.
Thank you.
We'll see you soon, Kelly Riddell there.
Okay.
As the president continues this historic trip to Cuba, the communist government is cracking